Hello guys, welcome to video 2 in the Hypertrophy series. Today what we are embarking on is a shoulder builder episode. So we're hitting all three heads of the deltoid, which is the shoulder muscle, starting with the posterior, moving on to the lateral, which is the side, and then finishing off with the anterior, which is the front. I'm hitting these muscles back to front, basically in an attempt to fatigue the weakest muscle fibers first and then move on to the strongest. So even though we have little resistance, by the time we come to fatiguing the anterior deltoid, which is most normally the strongest, we should have put in a great amount of work and stress into the shoulder joint and the muscles that it's not going to take much more. Had we done this in the reverse order, we probably wouldn't have fatigued the muscle fibers to the same extent. Just to kick off then with this video, you're seeing a bunch of exercise for the rear delts or the posterior deltoid, the back of your shoulder muscle. We're using a multitude of rear delt raises using bands and the towel. Now the whole point of the towel is we're exerting force against an immovable object, which is the closest that you can really get to exerting maximal muscular force at home. The towel is immovable, as I've said. Exerting the pull on that in replicating the rear delt raise allows us to fatigue the muscle fibers that we would be able to with heavy weight. Obviously, not a lot of us have access to that. So the next best option is this isometric contraction, where we're administering as much force as possible to the towel. This contraction, this isometric, is held for around 30 seconds. Sometimes you'll find if you're not used to this, you'll drop out a little sooner, like myself. I only get maybe 15-20 seconds. But again, that's enough to really fatigue the fibers in the shoulder. Next up, we're moving on to partial repetitions. Again, the band doesn't have a great deal of resistance, so we're going to use that to our advantage. We have doubled the band up and we have it threaded under our feet, which you'll see later on in the video. I'll move the angle of the camera. We are doing partial reps, which basically is a quarter of the repetition at the very bottom of the movement. And this allows us to fatigue it in its lengthened state. Once we're finished there, we change the angle of the band by, instead of triple looping it, only double looping it. And that allows us to get a little more of the band. It allows us to bring our arms up further. And then this allows us to hold a bit of a favoritism to the top part of the movement. So instead of doing it in the lengthened, we're going to do it in the contracted, in the shortened state. And that allows us to really hit all three stages of the movement. As you can see now from the video, I've got the towel under my feet. I'm grabbing the towel with a nice firm grip and pulling out like a rear delt raise. If you've never done a rear delt raise before, it's a bit like a row, but it's more shoulder dominant. So instead of pulling to the midline, you're almost trying to pull the towel to your face. And again, the feet are going to stop that. Aiming for 30 seconds here. I think I conked out at maybe 20 seconds. Again, I'm not used to doing this as well, hence why it's so effective. If you can't get the 30 seconds, don't fret too much. Now, a beach towel will work. If you have a little bit of garden hose or rope, that'll do the same job, but I'm assuming everyone's going to have a towel. As you can see here with the band, again, that's draped under my feet. I'm crossing the band over by threading one loop through the other, and that's going to add a little bit more resistance. It's going to limit my range of movement. And from here, I'm going to do the bottom part of the movement. As you can see, there's not very much movement, but just enough to get the bottom range. 10 to 12 reps, trying to keep the arms straight but not locked out. And again, with the resistance band, it gets harder the further away from its origin point you go. So at the top, there's more resistance there. That's what we want. Next, we're unlooping the band to get a little bit more range of movement and to also make it a little lighter. And this allows us to do a bit more range of motion. So now we can get the band up a little further and we're working more in the top half of that movement in the contracted part. And again, 12 to 15 reps, but depending on the band you may have, I'm going to recommend going to failure. So if that's less or more reps, again, that's your call. Just try and go to failure as much as possible. The final exercise we're doing here is almost a band pull apart, bringing the hands sort of towards where the knees are out towards the back, retracting the scapula, and that again is going to train the rear delt and a little bit of the side delt, the deltoid, sorry, through full range of motion in comparison to the partials we've been doing there at the start. That's 2 rounds with very little rest in between. You can do 3 or 4 if you like, but I'd rather you done more reps to fatigue yourself and to go closer to failure in the first 2 sets. If you need to do a third, that's okay, but really try and give it all your effort for those first 2 or 3 sets. Now you can see we've moved on to the lateral deltoid, or the side part of the shoulder, and we're doing the same thing. We're exerting force on an immovable object, which is allowing us to recruit more fibers. This time we're doing it in basically imitation lateral raise. Now, if you have a shorter towel, I would recommend maybe sitting down a little bit further or bringing your feet closer together. You want to get your arms at maybe 45 degrees if you can. Even slightly less is fine. Sitting upright rather than bent over with the rear delt raise as well. Next, we are threading the band under our feet. Again, I'll show you a different angle of this later on. The band is around the wrist rather than the hand, so we're removing the bicep and forearm from the equation. And we're going to do a slightly bent arm lateral raise, just bringing arms up to the side to almost imitate a T shape. We're going to go to 12 to 15 reps. With this band, for me, that was pretty much failure. In the second and third sets, I really only got 8 or 9 reps. So again, I'm going to encourage you to go as close to failure as possible. Once we finish the 12 to 15 reps, we're going to go to the highest position we can with the band. And we're going to hold that phase until the arms reach failure. Take 20-30 seconds rest, and then we're going to go back in. For the purpose of this, I'm speeding right through. If you feel that you can as well, feel free. But you may feel that you need more rest. That's perfectly okay. Let's do that instead. Again, guys, this is really going to dictate how much effort you put into the isometric contraction against the immovable force in the first section. And it's also going to massively be influenced by the resistance band that you have too. So don't be worried if it doesn't look exactly like this. But again, the key here is to try and go as close to failure as we can and deliver as much stimulus through the muscle. Starting round 2, again, grabbing the towel, we're going to go into our isometric lateral raise. You'll find towards the end of these sets, like the second or third set, you won't be able to hold the isometric as long as you can in the first. Please don't be disappointed in that. That's actually a good sign. It just shows you that you really are fatiguing. Now, if this towel was gone and we were in a gym setting, this would be like heavy weights to fatigue the muscle fibers, the fast twitch muscle fibers. But because a lot of us don't have that access, as I've said, this is the next best that we can get. Moving on again to the lateral raises under the feet. Hopefully you can see a little bit better the way I have the band underneath. Now, if the band over the top of the wrist is a bit uncomfortable, feel free to just hold it in your hand. It's just a little tip that I've tried to include. A lot of people tend to feel some of these raises more in their biceps or their arms or even their neck muscles. Over the forearm tends to just remove that from the equation altogether. So it is a slightly better way to do it. But again, if it's too uncomfortable, feel free not to. Another alternative to this is to maybe put a little bit of toweling or even some grip handles if you have them from like maybe a tennis racket underneath the band, and that should make it a little bit more comfortable. For the final isometric there, you'll notice as well that I'm not getting a great deal of time. That is okay. Don't worry. After doing the isometric at the start and then your repetitions afterwards, it's completely okay if you're a little fatigued to do maybe only 10 to 15 seconds. I'm lucky enough that the seat that I'm sitting on today is normally quite low. That's just the structure of my couch. If most of your seats are too high, you could do this kneeling alternatively. It's also going to allow you to keep the towel under your body a bit more as well. I found throughout this that the towel kept sort of lifting my feet off the ground. If you're kneeling, that's just not going to happen. And if you did have a massively long towel, you could maybe even do the standing, but again, kneeling will work just fine. The first section of this, I only showed 2 rounds, but this one I've showed 3. For me, my weak delts would be my posterior, my rear delts, the back of my shoulder. I only showed 2 rounds, but I actually did 3. But a lot of you will find that after maybe 2, you are fatigued. The side part of your shoulder is slightly stronger, especially if you're used to going to the gym and doing upright rows and presses. You probably will maybe need to do either a few more repetitions or maybe 1 more round to try and fatigue them. Feel free to do that. Alternatively, if you think you need to do more for the posterior delt, again, feel free. It doesn't have to match this exactly. Now, the resistance band I'm using today is the red one. It's quite strong. Not that it's designed to be, it's just the material is quite stiff because it's a rather new band. Sitting worked out quite well for this because it didn't stretch the band that much. If I try to do these exercises standing, it just wouldn't happen. So if you have a band that is ridiculously light, maybe standing is going to work a little bit better because that's going to allow you to stretch the band a greater deal and get a little bit more resistance out of it. Okay, so finally we're moving on then to our anterior deltoid, which is the front of our shoulder, the strongest head. And there are a few isometric exercises that you could do for this, and there's quite a few isolation exercises like a front delt raise. Today I have went with upright row, and that's what we're starting off with, an upright row isometric. So we've bunched the towel in the middle, standing on it to keep it a bit more secure, and you're pulling the towel, or well, exerting the force to pull the towel up as much as you can for that 15 to 30 seconds. Personally, I prefer the upright row just because it includes the other heads of the deltoid and doesn't just isolate the front head. And at this point, feeling quite fatigued, I thought that was the best choice. The good benefit of this is it also hits the muscles leading up to the neck, the traps and the rhomboids behind, or sorry, between your scapula even, if I can get that right. So I think overall it's just a little bit more healthy of a move to put in for the shoulder joint. Once we're finished the towel isometric, loop the band under your feet, grab the middle of the band. As you can see, I'm having a little difficulty with this. I actually looped it around my foot and then under, just to give the band a little bit more tension. And then you go into basic upright rows, keeping your legs wide to allow your hands to travel. The good thing about the band is it allows your hands to change position unlike the fixed path of a barbell, so it's much more healthy for the shoulder girdle. 12 to 15 reps, but again, that's going to be dictated by the band. It could be less, could be more. Just try and go as close to failure as possible. Then we're going to rest 3 to 4 seconds. I've made the band a little bit looser for this just because I have hit a good deal of fatigue, and we're going to go into a final isometric at the contracted phase of this movement, which is at the very top. I've went for a slightly wider grip, and we're going to pull up as much as we can, and we're going to hold there until we really can't anymore and our arms are forced back down due to the resistance of the band and gravity. Again, this could be 10 seconds, this could be 30, it just depends how much you fatigue those muscles. Again, go to failure. It's the easiest way to really get that in. I've moved my hands closer for the last one, making it a little more arm dominant, and I'm going to finish off with the same thing, an isometric, until my arms fail. At this point, my shoulders are quite tired. I actually only did 2 rounds of this because I felt I was sufficiently well worked. Again, if you need to do 3, feel free. Again, with this, we don't want to completely annihilate the muscle. A phrase I've heard of a lot of athletic individuals, and one of my favorite sports scientists, Ross Edgley, is the goal is to stimulate, not annihilate. So we're leaving a little bit in the tank for all of these, just to stimulate the most growth that we can. This whole workout actually only took just shy of 30 minutes before editing, so it's quite feasible as well to get in, especially if you have a lot of time in your hands. But considering the amount of muscles that we're working and the amount of stimulus we're introducing to the muscles, it's quite beneficial. It's quite time effective as well. So there's the towel gone, if I can pronounce that correctly. We're moving then into our upright rows. Now again, the same thing applies if your resistance band is quite weak. As I like to call them, pathetic resistance bands. But again, we can't really be choosy with what we have. Feel free to do the standing or to stand on a little bit more of the band just to reduce how much plastic is being stretched. This will make it a little harder and it'll allow you to push a lot more stress through the shoulder heads. I'm taking quite a close grip with the upright rows. For me, that's ideal for my shoulder structure. Play around with the grip. You may need a slightly wider one. This could work for you as well. But don't be afraid to lock yourself into one position if it's not exactly perfect. Another tip, I did this in bare feet. The resistance band can be a little bit cutting on the feet, so try and wear shoes if you can. Of course, I'm in my living room, so shoes aren't really an option. So guys, just to summarize, that is all three heads of the shoulder hit quite well, stimulated, not annihilated. That's a great deal of work put in. I hope everyone